The United States buried a nuclear reactor inside Greenland's ice sheet. They left behind hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, toxic chemicals, and radioactive coolant. Their assumption was simple: the ice would never melt. But here is the catch. The ice is melting, and everything they buried in 1967 is slowly rising back toward the surface. This is the story of Camp Century, a classified military base carved into a glacier, a city under ice, a nuclear reactor buried 100 feet beneath the frozen surface of the Arctic, and the terrifying reason why 50 years of secrets are about to become our generation's crisis. The perfect shield Greenland sits almost exactly between North America and Europe, with the Arctic stretching toward what was then the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, any nuclear missile launched at American cities would pass directly over Greenland. That made this frozen island the front line of early warning. The United States built Thule Air Base to track Soviet bombers and monitor missile launches. But Thule was only the visible part of the strategy. What made Greenland truly valuable wasn't just its location. It was the ice. Greenland's ice sheet was believed to be permanent, more than a mile thick in places. To military planners, this ice looked like nature's own armor. It blocked satellites. It absorbed sound. It hid heat signatures. And it moved so slowly, they treated it as if it didn't move at all. The logic was simple. If the ice never melts, anything buried inside it never returns. But here is the catch. The military didn't just want to use Greenland as a watchtower. They wanted to turn it into a hidden nuclear missile base. Project Iceworm. In the late 1950s, a group of American military planners conceived one of the most audacious weapons projects in history. They called it Project Iceworm. The plan was to build a network of tunnels stretching thousands of miles beneath Greenland's ice, wide enough for trains, deep enough to be invisible from the air. And inside those tunnels, they would deploy hundreds of mobile nuclear missiles that could be constantly relocated, making it nearly impossible for the Soviets to target them in a first strike. From above, nothing would be visible, just endless ice and snow. But beneath the surface, one of the largest weapon systems ever imagined would be silently moving through a frozen maze. Greenland would become a living nuclear labyrinth. To test whether this was even possible, the military needed a prototype, a proof of concept that could demonstrate whether humans could actually live, work, and operate heavy military infrastructure inside a moving glacier. That prototype was called Camp Century. Officially, the base was described as a scientific research station. Press releases showed smiling scientists with drills and measuring equipment. But behind the closed doors of the Pentagon, Camp Century had a very different purpose. It wasn't about science. It was a rehearsal for nuclear war. If this Cold War secret is news to you, hit that subscribe button. Because what they built inside the glacier is even more disturbing. The city under Ice Camp Century was built nearly 100 miles inland from Greenland's northwest coast. Engineers didn't construct it on the ice. They carved it directly into the glacier itself. From the surface, nothing looked unusual. Just endless white terrain stretching to the horizon. Blinding snow. Howling wind, temperatures that could drop to 50 below zero. Any aircraft flying overhead would see nothing. Any satellite scanning the region would detect nothing. But beneath that frozen blanket, they built something that had never been attempted in human history. A city under ice. Construction began in 1959. Crews worked in conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limit. They used massive rotary snow cutters called Peter plows to carve trenches through the ice, Then they reinforced those trenches with steel arches, packed the snow above them, and let the Arctic cold harden the roof into a ceiling stronger than concrete. When they were finished, they had created a grid of tunnels more than a mile long. And inside this frozen maze, they built sleeping quarters with bunk beds stacked 3 high, a hospital with operating facilities, a kitchen and mess hall where men would eat meals under flickering fluorescent lights, a small chapel for prayer, a gymnasium for exercise, even a movie theater where soldiers could escape into films while surrounded by thousands of feet of ice pressing down from every direction. But here is the catch. At the heart of this frozen city, they installed something that had never been attempted in human history. A portable nuclear reactor called the PM-2A. This was the first time nuclear power was operated beneath an ice sheet. The reactor was shipped in pieces, assembled, underground, and used to generate electricity, heating, and hot water for the entire installation. A nuclear reactor, inside a glacier. At its peak, Camp Century housed around 200 soldiers and scientists. Among them was Private First Class Thomas Carr, a 22-year-old electrician from Wisconsin who had volunteered for Arctic duty, thinking it would look good on his service record. He spent 11 months underground, maintaining the electrical systems that kept the base alive. Years later, Carr would describe the experience as living inside a freezer that groaned. The cold was constant and inescapable. Even with heating systems running at full capacity, the temperature inside the tunnels rarely climbed above freezing. Men wore layers of clothing to bed. Their breath formed clouds in the air as they spoke. Ice crystals grew on the walls of their sleeping quarters. The darkness was absolute. For months during the Arctic winter, the sun never rose above the horizon. Outside was a void. Inside was a maze of artificial light and recycled air. Diesel fumes from generators mixed with the smell of cooking food and human sweat. The ventilation systems hummed constantly, but the air always felt stale. Mechanical failures were a daily occurrence. Pipes froze and burst. Generators broke down. Vehicles refused to start in the extreme cold. Everything required constant maintenance, constant attention, constant vigilance. And beneath all of it, there was the quiet awareness that thousands of feet of ice pressed down from above. The glacier groaned and creaked. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors at night. The men knew that above them was a weight beyond imagination, held back only by steel arches and their own engineering. Psychologists quietly observed how the men reacted to the isolation. Tension built. Routine became survival. Every sound echoed through the frozen corridors. But the biggest threat wasn't psychological. It was geological, because the glacier wasn't staying still. It was slowly, relentlessly, pressing in from every direction, and the engineers were about to discover a truth that would destroy their dreams. When the ice fought back, here's what the planners got wrong about Greenland. They looked at the ice sheet and saw solid ground, just colder. They assumed it was stable, predictable, and slow enough to be controlled with steel supports and constant maintenance. In their minds, ice was just another building material. But ice is not rock. It's not concrete. And it doesn't stay still. Glacial ice flows, it compresses, it creeps under its own weight, inch by inch, day after day. Tunnels that looked perfectly straight one year would twist and bend the next. Steel supports warped, ceilings sagged, walls slowly closed in. But here is the catch. The glacier didn't care about their blueprints. At Camp Century, this wasn't a theory. It was daily life. Maintenance became a constant battle. Crews had to shave ice off the walls, and reshape corridors just to keep doors opening. Sections that were once wide enough for heavy equipment started to pinch closed. Floors buckled. Roof arches groaned under pressure that never stopped. Some corridors shrank by several inches every single year. The base was literally being crushed back into the glacier that had been cut open to create it. The deeper engineers dug, the clearer the truth became. You could cut ice, you could shape it, but you could not command it. And then there was the heat problem. Even though the tunnels stayed far below freezing, the base itself created warmth where warmth didn't belong. Human bodies, generators, pipes, kitchens, and especially that nuclear reactor, all introduced heat into a system that depended on cold to stay strong. The physics of glaciers didn't care about blueprints or military urgency. The ice followed its own rules, driven by pressure, temperature, and gravity. And those rules made Project Iceworm's vision of a vast tunnel network completely impossible to maintain. By the early 1960s, the dream began to collapse. Camp Century remained operational, but the grand plan behind it quietly died. The United States had learned a hard lesson. You can hide weapons from your enemies, but you cannot hide them from physics. And so they made a decision that would echo forward through decades. They decided to walk away. What they left behind when the United States shut down Camp Century, they didn't clean it up. They just left. Officially, the mission ended quietly in 1967. The nuclear reactor was dismantled piece by piece. The fuel rods were carefully removed and shipped back to the United States aboard military transports. On paper, the nuclear danger was gone. But what remained under the ice was not an empty shell. It was a buried inventory of the Cold War itself. Under the snow and ice, engineers left behind hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel stored in tanks and pipelines. This fuel had powered vehicles, heaters, and backup systems during the camp's 8 years of operation. At the time, diesel was seen as inert in the Arctic environment, locked away by cold, harmless. They also left PCBs, toxic industrial chemicals commonly used in electrical equipment during the mid-20th century. PCBs were not yet widely recognized as dangerous. Today, they are known to persist in ecosystems for decades, accumulating in animal tissue and causing cancer, immune system damage, and reproductive problems. The PCBs at Camp Century are still there, still toxic, still waiting. They left sewage systems filled with biological waste from years of human occupation, gray water from showers and sinks, food waste from the mess hall, the accumulated refuse of 200 men living underground for nearly a decade. And they left something else, something more dangerous than all the rest combined. The reactor's cooling system had used water that became contaminated during operation. Low-level radioactive coolant that had circulated through the heart of the PM2A. That coolant was never removed. It was dumped into the ice under one simple assumption: it would remain frozen forever. No cleanup plan was ever created. No environmental impact assessment was conducted. No binding international agreement defined who would be responsible if conditions ever changed. The conversations simply never happened. The paperwork was never filed. The future was someone else's problem. The waste was treated as solved by burial. The Arctic was treated as permanent. Greenland was treated as a freezer that would never be opened. And for 50 years, that assumption held. But the ice had other plans. The melting truth. For decades, scientists believed Greenland's ice sheet changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Early climate models assumed stability measured in centuries. The Arctic was viewed as eternal, unchanging, as permanent as the mountains themselves. That assumption no longer holds. Something has shifted in Greenland, something unprecedented, something that the military planners of 1959 could never have imagined. Satellite data now shows that Greenland is losing ice faster than any 20th century projection predicted. In recent years, the island has been shedding more than 200 billion tons of ice every single year. That's 200 billion tons of water running off into the ocean annually. Glaciers that took thousands of years to form are retreating in decades. Summers are lasting longer. The melt season now stretches weeks beyond what it was just a generation ago. Surface melt is spreading farther inland, reaching areas that were once considered permanently frozen. What once refroze each winter now runs downhill as liquid water, carving channels and crevasses through ice that was supposed to last forever. But here's the catch. The melt isn't just statistical. It's already reaching depths that were supposed to stay frozen forever. Dr. William Colgan, a glaciologist at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, has spent years tracking the site. His research team's models show that under current warming trends, seasonal melt could reach Camp Century's buried waste within this century. In his words, the site is no longer a relic of the past. It's becoming an active environmental hazard, and when meltwater reaches buried waste, it doesn't stay put. Water moves. It flows downward through cracks and porous ice, then outward toward the ocean. If it encounters diesel fuel, PCBs, sewage, or radioactive residue, it carries those materials with it. Slowly at first, invisibly, but inevitably. The contamination wouldn't appear as a dramatic explosion or a sudden spill. It would be gradual. Traces entering coastal waters, toxins accumulating in sediments, pollutants moving into food chains that local communities have relied on for generations. What was locked in ice becomes part of the Arctic system, and the question of who cleans it up has no clear answer. The reckoning Camp Century was built and operated by the United States. The waste came from American military systems. American engineers designed the base. American soldiers lived inside it. American generals approved the mission. But the base sat on Danish territory in what is now self-governing Greenland. When the camp was abandoned, no binding agreement defined who would handle the cleanup if the ice ever changed. Now the ice is changing, and the silence is becoming impossible to maintain. The United States has acknowledged that nuclear fuel was removed, but has avoided detailed discussion of the remaining waste. Official statements emphasize what was taken out, not what was left behind. Denmark has called for diplomatic dialogue, recognizing that the issue requires international cooperation. Greenland's government has raised moral concerns, arguing that decisions made without their consent are now becoming their burden to carry. AKA Niviana, a Greenlandic climate activist and indigenous rights advocate, has spoken publicly about what this means for her community. The hunters and fishermen who live along Greenland's coast depend on waters that could soon carry contamination from a military project they were never consulted about. Their seal hunting grounds, their fishing waters, their children's inheritance. As she put it, our ancestors did not bury this poison, but our children will have to live with it. This isn't just a legal debate. It's a question of accountability across generations. It's a question of who pays the price when powerful nations make decisions and weaker communities bear the consequences. The Cold War ended decades ago. The planners who approved Camp Century are gone. The engineers who trusted the ice are retired or deceased. The politicians who signed off on the mission have faded into history, books, and cemetery plots. But the consequences of their assumptions are unfolding in real time. What makes this moment different is visibility. We can now map Camp Century using ice-penetrating radar. We can measure ice loss from space with satellite precision. We can predict future melt with increasing accuracy using climate models that grow more sophisticated every year. Ignorance is no longer an excuse. The data exists. The projections are clear. The timeline is shortening. And still, no comprehensive cleanup plan has been announced. No international agreement has been signed. No timeline has been established. The waste continues to wait. The ice continues to thin. And the clock continues to tick. Right now, beneath Greenland's ice sheet, hundreds of thousands of gallons of diesel fuel sit in corroding tanks. PCBs that were considered safe in 1960 leach into the frozen ground. Radioactive coolant from a reactor that hasn't operated in 60 years waits in the darkness. The ice above is thinning. Every summer, meltwater drills deeper. Every year, the distance between the surface and the waste grows smaller. Camp Century is not a metaphor. It's not a cautionary tale. It's 200,000 gallons of fuel. It's 24 million gallons of contaminated wastewater. It's a toxic inventory buried 100 feet beneath ice that is disappearing faster than anyone predicted. The soldiers who lived there have grown old or passed away. The military planners are long gone. The politicians who approved the mission have faded into history. But the waste remains. The fuel remains. The contamination remains. And every single year, it gets closer to the surface. The ice kept its promise for 50 years. Now it's breaking. When the contamination finally reaches the ocean, who will be held accountable? Let me know what you think in the comments. If this story shocked you, smash that like button and subscribe for more buried history the world forgot.